sooner we get started, the sooner we can finish, right? So, we spent last week talking a lot about sort of inputs, right? We talked about that sensory system business. Okay. Briefly covered all your sensory systems. That's great. Everybody loves collecting information, right? But you collect that information, what are you going to do with it? Well, you probably should change your behavior accordingly, right? Maybe you should control some movement. So today, let's talk a little bit about movement. There's a good bit of stuff we're going to skip because it's not terribly important for this class, but might be important for another class, right? For our purposes, we're really only concerned with skeletal muscle. For control of movement, there are other types of muscle, right? You guys are familiar with those. They're located in other places like your gut and your heart, right? You're not really controlling those very much. So we're not really too interested in those. There's a ton of input back and forth between those muscles and your nervous system, right? Still a very sort of major connection there. We'll actually spend a whole chapter talking about ingestive behavior, right? Because of the massive connections between your brain and your digestive system, right? You can see why that would be an important thing to do. But for the purposes of this chapter, we're not too interested in that. Really only interested in those skeletal muscles, and you can, flex or extend. Don't have to worry about that. We do want to spend a little bit of time thinking about this concept of a motor unit, right? And what is a motor unit? When we talk about a motor unit, what does that mean, right? For our purposes, a motor unit is the motor neuron and any associated muscle fibers that it will control. Okay. Why is this important? Well, the relationship or the ratio between motor neuron and muscle fibers changes in different parts of your body, right? And that change in that structure is based on what you're trying to do with those parts of your body, right? So if we want to make a comparison, let's think about our legs and let's think about our eyes for a moment. Okay? If you compare the sort of control you have over eye movements versus leg movements, you'll realize you have much more control over eye movements, right? You can make much finer, smaller eye movements, more directed, more precise than you can with your legs, right? Your legs can kind of swing back and forth, and some people can swing them out to the sides. Not everybody can do that one, so don't try it or you'll maybe break a hip. I don't want to send anybody to the hospital. So, not doing a lot of stuff with your legs. So, what do we have? We have one motor neuron and just a whole bunch of muscle fibers, right? That can control one muscle or one part of one muscle in your leg. Because again, we're not looking for that really fine movement, right? Let's just move our leg forward and back. Okay, not a big deal. For your eyes, on the other hand, we want one motor neuron. We only want a few muscle fibers, right? Maybe even only one muscle fiber. Because we want that fine control over moving your eyes just that small distance, right? That small, directed, precise distance. Okay? So that motor unit, the structure of that motor unit is going to change as we move through different parts of our body. Again, that's going to be related to what we're trying to do with that part of your body. All right, you've got different kinds of muscle fibers. That's not really going to be something I ask you about, but if you're really excited about that, feel free to read it. All right. There's an out-of-focus picture of a woman doing something. Again, I'm not going to ask you about flexion and extension and any of the other kind of business, right? That's some stuff from another course that you might think about. If we're thinking about the skeletal muscle, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on like sliding filament theory. I don't know anybody really excited about that. Nobody. Some people might be, right? And it's cool. It's an awesome thing, right? Now you guys should read about it. It's not going to make a huge difference in what we do. We will think about, though, when that motor neuron comes down, right? And it's going to contact onto your skeletal muscle. That interface, it's got a bunch of fancy names, right? Neuromuscular junction. And really, just means where your nervous system meets your muscular system, right? I know it's a really complicated sort of thing. So, neuromuscular junction, not a big deal. Why can the nervous system and the skeletal muscles, or any other muscles, why can they communicate? They both speak the same language, right? They both use some sort of electrical signal, okay? And as long as we're using that electrical signal, and again, we're using that electrochemical, right? Because we go from an electrical signal to those neurotransmitters, back to an electrical signal. As long as we're able to use that same language, these guys can communicate directly, right? So we can communicate directly from our nervous system to our either skeletal muscles or other muscles. Doesn't matter, right? That's how we control other muscles as well. Although typically involuntarily. All right, we already talked about motor units. I'm not going to ask you about these other things. This is that fun, like actin and myosin filaments. Again, if you're really excited about this, you can think about it. It's not going to make a huge difference for us when we're thinking about behavior, but these are how your muscles contract. They get shorter, it moves things up, like closer to your body, or changes that angle into a smaller angle, and then you need to relax that, or pull from the other side, right? All right, neuromuscular junction. We talked about this. It's a synapse. Terminal buttons coming down, probably from your primary motor cortex. We'll talk about that in a few moments. Right? And that's going to contact the muscle fiber. Not a big deal. Sometimes we call this guy the motor end plate. That's a real fancy term, right? It's simply the other side of that synapse, right? It's just where we're landing, where we're hitting. Why do we call it the motor end plate? Because it's a muscle. And end plate potential, we already know what potentials are. Just going to be in that muscle, right? And this is going to be under the control of acetylcholine. Acetylcholine. That's the neurotransmitter that's going to control muscle contractions. If you have a problem either creating or breaking down acetylcholine, you will have some movement difficulties, right? If you can't create acetylcholine, guess what happens? You don't move. If you can't break down acetylcholine, guess what happens? You move once, right? And you get stuck there because you can't relax those muscles, right? They can contract, but they can't relax. So you need a guy called acetylcholine esterase, right? Anything with like an ASE at the end, ACE at the end, just means it chops something up, right? This comes through, it's a chopper. It's going to break something down. No longer is it going to be acetylcholine, it's going to be two other things that aren't going to cause your muscles to contract, and they can relax, you can go about your business. We talked about previously different kinds of venom, right? We talked about botulism, and we talked about black widow spider venom, right? And both of those affect acetylcholine in different ways and cause different problems. All right. I'm not going to ask you much about these Golgi tendon organs. Do know, though, that you have sensory receptors in your muscles, right? These guys are really sensitive to stretch. Okay. So we want to keep an eye on that. You want to know how much you're stretching your muscles. You can respond accordingly. So, here's an example with those Golgi tendon organs. If you look down here, these are sort of just, your arm is moving, right? Not really a big deal there. You're getting a little bit of activation of the Golgi tendon organs, right? They are active because we are stretching. But if all of a sudden a weight is dropped into your hand, right? Maybe you're, running behind a bird and all of a sudden it lays an egg and you catch it. Seems reasonable. Maybe you try to catch other things that fall out of the sky. I don't know what you do with your lives. But let's imagine you catch something, right? It's kind of dropped in. Notice there's a bit of an increase here in the firing rate, right? With that, because that stretch has increased, right? So you can sense that stretch better, and you're going to need to be able to respond to that so you can try to get your arm back to that position. Right? You're holding your arm in position, weight gets dropped in, your arm's obviously going to go down a little bit. That's pretty standard. You go back up and then you change that firing pattern. Not too big of a deal. How many of you love reflexes? These are great, right? There are things called monosynaptic reflexes. It means there's only one synapse. Okay? When something happens here, there's nothing you can do to change it. You've got a sensory neuron and a motor neuron, and that's it. Okay? Input comes in, output happens. This happens because a muscle is quickly stretched. If you stretch a muscle quickly, it'll try to contract, right? That's that reflex. Okay? This is why, how many of you have ever been whacked in the knee and you kick somebody? Right? This is a standard thing, right? When they hit you in the knee, what are they doing there? They're really stretching the muscle on the top of your leg, right? When you stretch that muscle, what's the response? What's the reflex? It's for that muscle to contract. When it contracts, what happens? Your lower leg kicks up, right? And that's exactly what's happening here. There are also polysynaptic reflexes, right? This includes more than one synapse. The cool thing about polysynaptic reflexes is that you can adjust these, right? So you can override them. We talked about this when we talked about the iron. Remember, we had the guy who had, what's the handle on the iron, in case you didn't know. The guy had the iron and he stuck out his finger. He's got these long, sort of squiggly fingers. Stuck out his finger to see how hot the iron was, and of course you're naturally going to pull back from that, right? But sometimes you need to hold on to something that's hot, right, for a few moments to prepare, so you can override that. If it's a polysynaptic reflex, not a big deal. Oh, some other fun reflexes. The withdrawal reflex, if you step on something. How many of you have ever stepped on nails, broken glass, stepped on a cat tooth one time? That was not in a cat, Tyler. Just in case you wanted to know, like sometimes you can put your foot in a cat's mouth, right? And that happens. I don't know, we had a cat that lost a tooth. It was a kitten, right? And then like the molar, it's like a cat molar, which is kind of interesting. Still have it at home if you want to see it, Trevor. I'll bring it into class next week. I did a little display case and everything. Tagged it with the day I found it. All right, don't worry about the gamma motor system. We've already talked about that. Polysynaptic reflexes. Okay. Now we should move sort of out of, previously we've just been in like the muscles and the spinal cord, right? Doing a few things. We should move out of that. We should actually like get up into the brain. Think about the cortex. Think about that organization of the cortex, right? And think about some cool things there. So we have what's called the motor cortex. Right? The first, well, actually, the main structure that we're going to think about is the primary motor cortex. Now, previously we talked about, Abby, we talked about primary visual cortex, primary auditory cortex, and we said that's the first place that we're landing when we get into the cortex, right? Coming up from thalamus, okay? First place, we're getting that information in, that's awesome. It's sort of the reverse story with the motor cortex. And in fact, primary motor cortex is the last place in your cortex where there's going to be a motor command, right? It's going to be the last place. Because that's going to be sending the signal out to the rest of your body to actually perform that action. These other areas, premotor cortex, supplementary motor area, all of the other sort of cortical motor cortex regions are going to get information before motor cortex, primary motor cortex. Christina, they're going to take all that information, make those calculations, make that plan, get that to primary motor cortex, who's going to send it out the door to the rest of your body. Okay? So that's pretty cool, right? Primary motor cortex is actually one of the easiest places to find in your brain if you ever, split open your brain and take a look at it. You've got this thing called a central sulcus, kind of a crack down the middle, and you'll know that you're just rostral. That means toward the nose, so you're just sort of in front of that, right? So that's kind of exciting. What's really cool about motor cortex, and this was also true about somatosensory cortex, right, is that it's got what we call somatotopic organization. So basically, we have taken the human body, right? We've sort of squished it down, we distorted it, and then we just slapped it onto your brain, right? And that's the map that we have. And it's actually a pretty cool map. And it brings up some interesting concepts. So this is what we call the homunculus, which means distorted human. I know, Casey, that's exciting, right? I love to yell this when people cut me off on the road. I get a little bit of road rage sometimes, and I yell at people. I do. My wife thinks it's funny. I yelled at this old lady once, and I did. So we're driving down like the road, right? So we're driving down 3rd Avenue, okay? And there's an ambulance coming. So what do you do when there's an ambulance? You get out of the way. Standard story, right? Lights flashing, noise coming. Instead, this lady passes me and cuts me off. Like, well, there's an ambulance coming. So I use all the standard words, Brandon, and I make up a few new ones. Words you've never even heard of, right? I was making combinations left and right. I wish somebody had been there to write these down, because I think I added 10 words to the Webster's Dictionary that day. And so my wife was just like appalled at how angry I was about this. And I was like, you know, it's an ambulance. You get out of the way. So then the lady pulls over at Dr. Friday's or whatever that place is on 3rd Avenue. Anybody know? It's like a blue sign, says like Dr. Friday Simpson or something. I don't know. And an old lady gets out with a walker. And then my wife thought it was hilarious. I was yelling at the old lady. And then I thought, well, she shouldn't be on the road if you can't hear an ambulance. You don't belong on the road.
I mean, legally you don't have to pull over for ambulances, do you?
It's just polite. I start holding doors for people who are carrying packages. You don't have to do that. You slam it in their face. But it's polite, Megan. I've seen what you do to the people delivering pizzas. I don't know. Just made that up. She slams doors in people's faces. I can tell. You're that kind of person. So, the homunculus, right? It's a distorted human. Here's sort of what this looks like if you were to take this and actually try to redraw it, right? In terms of how much brain space we give to each part of your body, right? And so what you might think about is like, well, you know, my legs are really big, my back takes up a lot of space, my hands aren't that big, you know, compared to my back, so maybe I should have more space for my back than I should my hands. The problem with that is your back's not that important, right? What do you do with your back? Well, you can't really do much with it, right? It just keeps your head up, right? So if you didn't have a back, what would happen? Well, you just put your head right on top of your hips. Okay, you're not really missing anything, right? You don't have to buy shirts anymore. Just buy pants and bow ties, right? And you're done. Okay, you're not really losing a lot there because you can't do much. Think about your shoulders, right? How many of you have ever tried to change the oil in your car using your shoulders only? Doesn't work, does it, Trevor? Not usually, right? I mean, you're in there trying to like spin around that oil filter, like wedged between that. This doesn't work. Trust me, I've tried it. You typically want to use your hands. And your hands are pretty awesome, right? So your hands can do a lot of things. Think about all of the sort of movements you can make with your hands. Think about all of the sensory receptors you have in your hands and your fingertips, right? So that says I need a lot more brain space to control it, right? A lot of this relates back to that motor unit structure, right? So if you think about your hands and you see, wow, my hands take up, I mean, here's like palm, fingers, and thumb. I mean, that's like a huge chunk of space compared to what I have there for my arm, which is just a sliver, or my shoulders, which is small, or my abdomen, right? So relatively speaking, we devote more space to parts of our body that we need finer control of, right? So hands being a great example, feet, right? This was a lot more important than what was that thing? It's fairly recent. It just came out. Shoes. Yeah, before shoes, obviously being able to feel what you were walking on was a bit more important, right? Now, I mean, everybody, I don't know, I see those, what are those, Hoka running shoes that have like an insole. I tried a pair of those on once. I felt like it was breaking my toes off. I was like, forget that. It was just like, they're like this thick, the soles, right? So, most of the time we're not really feeling. There are a few exceptions probably. Some of you who wear those shoes that just have like this much of a sole and have those little pointy things coming out, right? You might be able to feel what you're running on just a little bit better than somebody who has like a thicker sole. So feet. The other one a lot of folks don't think about is like the face and lips, right, and tongue. Those are important because human communication, right? If you think about speech, right, that's going to really involve your mouth, your tongue, your lips, you're forming words, making sounds. That's very important, so we're going to devote a lot of brain space to that particular part of your body. Your legs, again, you're not doing much with your legs, right? Move them forward, move them backward, fold it underneath of you. Those are really the only three things you need to do with your legs. Okay? There's not a whole lot else there, right? So we're not going to give legs like a whole lot of space, just a little bit. We call this whole concept cortical magnification. And basically what that means is it's not important how much space it takes up in the real world. What's important is how much brain space do we need to give it. And why do we need to give it that much brain space, right? There's an interesting study a few years ago. They did a brain scan on a monkey, and then the monkey got in a fight, and one of the other monkeys bit off one of its fingers. Another monkey, yeah, I know, right? It's really exciting. So the monkey was missing a finger. What was cool is they actually went in and did a brain scan again because they're like, hey, we're going to have an opportunity for a monkey missing a finger again, right? We're going to do this brain scan. And what they found is after a few weeks, so like if you kind of divide this up amongst your fingers, right? What they found is that missing finger space, it didn't just die, but like the neighboring fingers sort of expanded to occupy that same space, right? Now that doesn't mean all of a sudden they've got like 4 super awesome fingers, right? That can do so much, So like don't think like, you know what, I've been really struggling, playing my musical instrument, like, I don't know, saxophone. But boy, I bet if I cut off one of my fingers, my other 3 would just get really great and I could really hit those notes. It's not going to work that way, right? Because you're still limited by the physical apparatus that you have, right? Which again is your fingers. Okay? Does that make sense? I always think about this though, right? Because I like to think about people who participate in activities that require them to constantly hold on to something that's not their body. I know that sounds a little weird for a moment, right? But I think about like tennis players, right? I wonder if they have like a part of their, right? Like, is there like a little bit here that's like, hey, that's shaped like a tennis racket now because they've been like swinging this racket for so long? I don't know, right? I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing. I'd love to get a brain scan of the Williams sisters. But the problem is, I'd have to get one of like them before they started playing tennis. So this is why we should get brain scans for everybody. Because you never know. You never know when you're going to get a mental disorder. You never know when you're going to do something awesome, and we're going to need that baseline brain scan. So just convince your insurance company to pay for that now, and I'm sure they will. Just go in and say like, hey, I just want one of those standard baseline fMRIs, They're cheap, right? They're like a $5 copay. Like the 4 of you who are laughing understand insurance. The rest of you are like, what's insurance? I got sick and my mom kissed my boo-boo. You guys will get it in 5 years. It's okay. Because you'll start your own insurance soon, and then it takes you another 2 or 3 years to figure it out. All right. Questions about the homunculus? It's kind of cool, right? You guys can go home and make one of these out of Play-Doh. What's interesting, and the one thing we didn't talk about, so here's your primary motor cortex, right? And that's that central sulcus I told you about. Right behind that, this is your somatosensory cortex, which is basically organized in the exact same way, with the exact same sort of size ratio, magnification ratio as motor cortex, right? So the sensory information you're getting in, you think about sensory information from your hands versus your legs. Well, you get a lot more information through your hands than you do through your legs in terms of sensory input. So you're going to have a larger part of somatosensory cortex for that. Similar for control, so they sort of match. All right, so here's some monkeys. This guy still has all his fingers, despite the fact that it looks like he's giving you the bird here. He's really not, I don't think. So what this is sort of interesting is that in this experiment, what the folks did is they stimulated particular regions of the motor cortex, and they did this for an extended period of time, right? It wasn't just like a quick flash, it was sort of this prolonged stimulation. And rather than just getting like a basic sort of movement, what was really interesting is they got sort of a sequence of movements, right? So they had some sort of cluster of movements here. So when they stimulated this particular region, they had some kind of grasping action, right? So the monkey would actually reach out and try to grab. There was nothing there. It was like reach out and grab. I bet this one was fun. You stimulate that part of the monkey's brain and it tries to take off leaping. I bet they only did that once. I don't have to chase a monkey all over the place, right, Tyler? I don't know if you've ever had to do that. Doesn't sound fun. Then there are other ones. A lot of these are like hand to mouth. A lot of them, again, are related to like facial things, defense behaviors. I don't know. I think that's more of a he went that way sort of action and try to make a face like you're not guilty. But you try to make some threatening gestures, make yourself appear bigger, right? So you can put, it's only one arm because they only stimulated like one side of the brain, right? So you only kind of get one side. But if you can imagine the monkey putting out this other arm, now see that looks a little more like a defense behavior, right? You kind of get both sides involved instead of just one side. So motor cortex, we typically think of it as sort of a simple, you stimulate this place and your finger twitches, right? And you can do that, but if you sort of make a slightly larger and more prolonged stimulation, you're actually going to get some sequence of behaviors. You guys don't need this information. All right. Now let's think about what happens in between, right? So we're getting this sensory information in, we sort of understand that process. We understand sort of that output process from primary motor cortex. What we've not thought about very much is what's going on in between there. What's that planning and initiating, right? What about these motor association cortex areas? What about that premotor area, that supplementary motor area? What are the other things that are going on so we can calculate that, right? It's actually a very, very complicated thing, right? You're trying to navigate a four-dimensional space, really, right? Because as you move through your environment, not only are you moving in 3 dimensions, but there's time involved as well, right? And there are other objects that are moving around you, and you have to adjust to that constantly, right? How many of you have ever caught a fly ball? All right, you said that reluctantly. I'd imagine a more prominent response from you, but that's okay, right? I'd really like, oh yeah, all the time. You're like, well, you know, occasionally that has happened in my life, but not as much. You're starting to understand my disdain for the softball team. Right? It's really disappointing. They invited me last year to throw out a pitch at a game, largely because the previous year I sort of made a big deal because they invited somebody else. Instead of me from my department, I thought, oh, that was horrible. They canceled the game where I was supposed to go out. It was canceled. Like, it's like they got it out against, other sports are fine. I have no problems with any others, it's just softball. All of you are problems. So, you catch a fly ball, right? You've done this. That's actually one of the most complicated things to get a robot to do, is to catch a fly ball. People do it all the time, right? And some people are better at it than others, let's give them that. But most people can do that with some proficiency, right? You can just go out and catch something that's flying in the air and it's going to land. But it's really complicated to get a robot to do that. And folks do this all the time, right? And they even do these like virtual reality things where they'll put goggles on folks like who are really good at catching fly balls and try to track like how they're running and where they're looking and all this information, which is really exciting. And then they try to like pump that into a robot, but it's the sort of the on-the-fly calculations that you're constantly making, right? You're constantly making these minor adjustments. And right now it's just a little bit more than what we're capable of doing, but They've got that robot that'll jump over boxes now. Right, Megan? It's pretty exciting.
That's really going to make a difference in our lives.
It is, because one of the things I hate doing is jumping over boxes. And if I can get a robot to do it for me, I never have to jump over another box. I really don't know what a robot jumping over boxes is going to do, but I think we're on the right track here. I'm just waiting. What was that movie with Bruce Willis where he was constantly in the cocoon, like controlling the other robot? He didn't do it, but like a bunch of other people did. Do you remember that one? Nah. Maybe it wasn't his best movie.
You get it?
No.
Surrogates.
What?
Surrogates?
That's it. See, there you go, Dylan. I was going to write plus surrogate, but that might be weird. I'm just going to give you a +1. So, anyway, planning these movements is very difficult, right? We're doing this constantly getting information, like feedback information. We'll talk about some of that in a moment. We're constantly sending out information, right? We're really trying to coordinate these two things. Your parietal lobe, right? You guys know that that's kind of located right up in here. Constantly getting information about your spatial location, the location of other objects in your space, right? You're taking that visual information, somatosensory information. We talked about vestibular and auditory information. You've got to integrate all of that, right? Sound, gravity, vision, where you are, right, and how you're moving through space. You're constantly using all of that information to calculate your movements. That's a lot of input, right? We're using our frontal cortex and that parietal cortex in conjunction to plan these movements. Okay? So, this is sort of a map of what's going on, right? We're getting that visual information coming in, we're getting some somatosensory information, auditory information, and it's not just current information, it's historical information as well, right? Because we've got to compare the sounds we're hearing to sounds we've heard in the past, what we're seeing to what we've seen in the past, right? And how that has behaved before, right? So that we can make those sort of adjustments. All of that info goes into your frontal cortex, right? It's up here in the front, you got a huge amount of space there. Planning those movements, thinking about those movements, what are we going to do? Going out to these different supplementary and premotor areas before we finally get to that primary motor cortex. We get that completed sequence of actions that we want to send out. We're going to send those signals to your body so you can perform that action, right? But sometimes you've got to make changes in the middle of that, right? And so sometimes you have to make these adjustments.
So the frontal lobe is what decides the movement based on, the frontal lobe is what decides the movement with all the information that sends it to the...
It's going to plan those movements, right? And it's going to send that information through a couple areas, but eventually to your primary motor cortex. So that information, those commands go out. Okay? Now, those commands don't just go out from your primary motor cortex to your body. They go to another spot kind of hanging down here that looks like broccoli called the cerebellum. Right? The cerebellum's pretty awesome. This is a guy that's giving you a bunch of feedback about the movements that you're making, right? And are you successfully completing those movements, Taylor, as you intended to complete them, right? And so this is what happens when you are walking and all of a sudden there's a set of stairs and you didn't know that. You sort of step and you step farther down than you've anticipated, right? Has anybody ever done that? And so you kind of have that weird feeling and you pull your foot back, right? That's what the cerebellum's doing. The cerebellum was like, I'm anticipating floor. If there's not floor, then something was wrong, and I need to kind of pull back and try something else, right? So we're constantly getting that feedback. This is one of the first areas to be affected by alcohol, right? That coupled with your vestibular system wackiness, right? Because alcohol gets in and screws up the density of your endolymph. Those two things together are what really make you such an athlete when you're drinking, right? No, it doesn't work that way, right? It really causes you some problems. So there you go. Again, premotor cortex, learning and executing complex movements, guided by sensory information, right? So this is not just going to be involved in executing, but you need to learn those movements as well, right? So if you are, I don't know, playing an instrument, if you're figure skating, if you're I don't know, how many of you knit or what crochet? Nobody's into those things, that's great. Somebody is, thank you. That's the thing. People do it, right? It's fine. So there you go. All right, here's a whole list of these areas and what they do. I'm not going to go through that whole list right now. All right, we already talked a little bit about cerebellum, but we should also think about the basal ganglia. These guys are pretty important. We're going to touch on the basal ganglia a lot later. There's a whole list of disorders and diseases that are involved there. Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, OCD, autism spectrum disorder. What's the abbreviation for Tourette's? Just put a T. I don't. There's not an abbreviation, is there? I'm going to have to spell it. Okay. All of these occur because there are other things going on often, but there's some sort of disruption in basal ganglia function. Don't worry about the reticular formation. We already talked about the cerebellum. A whole bunch of regions in the cerebellum that you don't really think about. But the basal ganglia, right? There are some brain regions you'll hear us talk about, the caudate and the putamen. Together, these guys make up something called the striatum. When we talk about Parkinson's disease, we'll talk about a breakdown in the nigrostriatal pathway. That's from the substantia nigra to the caudate and putamen to the striatum. There's a loss of dopaminergic cells there, so you're having some difficulties sort of activating voluntary or controlling voluntary movements, right? Huntington's disease is sort of an opposite of that. You have damage in these brain regions in the striatum, and instead of sort of having that tremor, right, to initiate movements, instead of having difficulty initiating a movement, what happens with Huntington's disease is you actually sort of randomly perform a sequence of movements, right? And so you'll get up and you'll just sort of perform a sequence of movements that you didn't intend to, right? That don't really match. That's why they used to call it Huntington's chorea. It's like a choreography. Sometimes folks with Huntington's disease will look like they're dancing, right? Because they'll be making these sort of awkward, unintentional movements.
How does OCD play into that?
Yeah, so that's actually a pretty good question. We'll talk a lot about OCD later. But in general, if you think about folks with OCD, there's sort of two components, right? There's the obsessions component, like, oh no, my house is going to burn down. And then there's the compulsion component, I've got to keep turning off the stove. And that's a motor. If you think about it, all compulsions are motor components, right? And so it's this stereotypical sort of repeated movements, and the basal ganglia is involved in that aspect of OCD. Same thing with autism. Autism spectrum disorder, most of those folks have some sort of stereotypical movement. They'll often rock back and forth and so forth, and that is a basal ganglia disruption.
What about something like excoriation? It's where people like, we learn about it in Angola, where people like look at their skin so much that would that be like a problem in that area? Or would that just be?
I don't know if anybody's looked at that particular issue. I would imagine if it's a repetitive movement, the basal ganglia is going to be involved. I mean, that would be my speculation on that. But I don't know if anybody's looked at basal ganglia involvement in that particular issue.
Or just anything like that?
Yeah, I really think anything that's a repetitive movement issue is going to be involved with basal ganglia. Tourette's, for example, Tourette's is typically it's like tics. It's going to involve basal ganglia. Any kind of involuntary movement, something you're not planning. That's repetitive or you can't control it. It's a good question. All right. There are different pathways in the basal ganglia, right? I'm not going to expect you to think a whole lot about this, but there's an excitatory pathway and an inhibitory pathway. Okay, so the direct pathway is going to be excitatory. That's not terribly easy to remember, but the indirect pathway is inhibitory. And that is pretty easy to remember because they're both starts with IN, right? Indirect, inhibitory, so you kind of think, well, those two go together. So what's left? Well, direct and excited. Okay? So here's that map of the basal ganglia, right? The direct pathway are going to be in the solid lines, and the indirect is going to be the dotted lines. Here's that pathway I was telling you about earlier, from the substantia nigra to the caudate and putamen, also known as the striatum. That's involved in Parkinson's disease. Again, any of these dotted lines are going to be inhibitory, right? So if you were having a problem, let's say, creating movements, right, initiating movements, right? Perhaps you could knock out the nucleus in that indirect pathway, right? And then you could make those movements a bit more smoothly. Who wants to talk about mirror neurons for a while? All right, I do. So we start. Mirror neurons are kind of a cool thing. They're relatively new. I say relatively new, 10, 15 years maybe. Folks have been talking about mirror neurons, something like that, yeah. So with a lot of things that are relatively new, somebody goes like, hey, mirror neurons, those are awesome. And they're like, okay, well, let's just use these to describe everything, right? And so a lot of folks have tried to, I think, over-apply what mirror neurons do and what they're involved in. We just don't really know. But mirror neurons are cool. We'll talk about those. They are mostly, well, they're actually in a lot of places, but the ones we're going to think about are going to be in the premotor cortex, right? And kind of in that parietal lobe. What's interesting about these is not only do they get excited when you make a movement, they get excited when you see someone make that same movement. Okay? So, how many of you know how to juggle? Nobody's going to admit it. Really? Yeah, thanks for owning up to that. Everybody else was too embarrassed to do so. It's okay. So, we've got a couple jugglers in the class, right? So, juggling's kind of an interesting thing. Let's say you watch someone juggle, right? And you have cells that are going to get excited while you're watching that. Those same cells will get excited when you do the juggling as well. What's great about that is if you're trying to learn how to do something, right? Some sort of movement thing, right? Something that's going to require you to move parts of your body. What's one of the best ways to learn how to do that? Watch somebody else do it, right? Okay. So, Blakely, when they were teaching you how to swing a bat, the first thing they do is they sit you down and they really go through this very long oral description of how to swing a bat, right? And they go, well, you have to hold the bat at a 33-degree angle from your shoulder relative to your knee, right? They didn't do this? No. That's a waste of time, right? What's the best way to do it? Here's how you swing a bat, and then you give it a try. We'll tell you what you did wrong, right? That's a much more effective approach. And it's a much more effective approach because we have this mirror neuron system. Right? We can watch other people do things. We can learn how to do that. Quite often you can learn how to do something just by watching someone else do it. You don't even necessarily need any sort of verbal guidance on that, right? It happens all the time.
Are they activated with the rubber hand thing?
That's an interesting question that I don't know that anybody knows the answer to. I would imagine let me think about that. I think the rubber hand would be more plasticity in the somatosensory cortex, although that could involve some mirror neurons. Mirror neurons is more, I watched someone else do the rubber hand illusion, now I can do it to you. Does that make sense?
So is it more kind of like the monkey see, monkey do kind of thing?
That's exactly how this was. and almost to the point that they discovered this in monkeys first. So that was a great, yeah. So the folks who discovered these mirror neuron system, it was this guy Giacomo Rizzolatti out of Italy. He was an interesting guy. Him and a bunch of other folks in his group, they discovered these in monkeys. They realized that there were cells that got excited when a monkey would see another monkey perform an action, and then when that monkey would perform the same action, they would get active. Which is not, I mean, we don't think it's that surprising now, but if you're thinking about motor cortex, you're really thinking about just stuff that's involved when you perform an action, right? Things that get activated when you see someone else perform an action should be like things in your visual cortex, right? To find cells like that in motor cortex or motor cortical areas is sort of what was interesting about that.
So what about when someone yawns and then you yawn? Is that this or something completely different?
I think that's different.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think that's going to be good. Because again, I think this is more like mimicking intentionally.
Okay.
There's some intentionality to this, right? Here's a particular study where they looked at musicians and non-musicians, right? So they had these non-musicians would watch someone, play an instrument, right? And then what they would see is that there were particular brain regions that got excited by watching and imitating, right? So when they would watch that happen, parts of their motor cortex would get excited, not their primary motor cortex necessarily, but other places. And then when they tried to mimic those actions, the same thing would happen. Don't worry too much about that. You should think about reaching and grasping, right? These are a couple of the sort of more important activities, right? More important actions if you think about how much you interact with your world using your hands, right? And appropriately being able to reach out and manipulate those objects is pretty important. If you go back a couple steps, more than probably a couple steps, evolutionarily speaking, reaching and grasping are still really important for survival, right? If you're like reaching out and grasping onto like tree branches or things. So there are brain regions devoted specifically to reaching. There's a parietal reach region, right? So there's a region just for reaching your arm out appropriately, the appropriate length, appropriate time, appropriate direction. And then there's also an area on that anterior part of the intraparietal sulcus that's going to control grasp. So, right, so Scotty, we're not even letting the same brain region do both of these, right? You got one for sticking your arm out and one for closing your hand around whatever's there, because that's such an important action. You don't think about that being so important, but the way you use your hands to manipulate your environment, interact with your environment is pretty important. All right, so this is a brain. You can see here is the parietal reach region, right? See that's active. Right. What about those times when you have difficulty moving? You have some brain damage, right? This is different. What we're going to talk about now is an apraxia. This is different than when someone has damage to motor cortex, right? So if you have damage to motor cortex or you have damage to your, the actual structure, let's say your arm or your leg, you have difficulty moving, well, that's a different story than an apraxia, right? Apraxia is going to involve, Brandon, it's going to be the frontal or the parietal cortex. So it's involved in the planning and coordination of the movements, right? That's where that difficulty is going to be. So what will happen sometimes is folks have something called limb apraxia, right? So in cases like this, what they'll do is they'll try to make a movement. Let's say they're doing something with their arm, but they're going to move the wrong part of their arm, right? Or maybe they move the correct part of their arm, but they move it in the wrong direction. They're trying to reach forward and they reach backwards, right? Okay, they're having difficulty planning that action. It's not necessarily a difficulty moving that body part, right? Because it is moving, but it's just moving in the wrong way or at the wrong time or in the wrong direction, right? And that's involved in the planning of that. And then finally, we have this interesting thing called constructional apraxia. This is sort of interesting. We should actually show a picture of that. This is when individuals, you'll show them a picture and you'll say, draw that. Okay. Now, this is not expecting everyone to be, like an art student. Let's say you try to draw that and you're like, well, that's not perfect, but there you go, right? You would see that and you think, well, that guy probably doesn't have any motor deficits, right? This is kind of the whole thing. But if you were to look at this particular copy, you would think, well, that person had some extreme difficulty copying, that particular model, right? I think what's really interesting about this is you see these individuals, when they do this, they'll make multiple sort of marks, to make the same surface, right? Okay. So they'll sort of continually, you see the multiple marks for each of those sides, right? Not sort of like one fluid movement. Okay. And these are folks with constructional apraxia. Again, this is going to be damaged in that frontal and parietal cortical regions. They're going to have difficulty sort of executing, planning that. It's almost like they want to make a mark, but then they're like, well, maybe if this is, let's just make all of the marks I was thinking about planning, right? So they're not really picking out the best mark there that they could make. Does that make sense? All right. Who's got questions about that?
There's also a speech